Welcome back, everyone. Of course, we're gonna look at Pike and Shot Warfare today. Glad you're here with me. Let's jump right in and understand what is this all about.
Pike and Shot Warfare was a response to forces dominating the late medieval battlefields of Europe, like Swiss pikemen and French gendarmes. French knights were unparalleled among the mounted troops of Europe, and the Swiss pike squares successfully defended themselves against cavalry with their long pikes. The depth of their formation also gave them the momentum necessary to rout enemy infantry by charging them directly. When French gendarmes and Swiss pikemen were deployed in combination, they seemed invincible. The first to successfully stand their ground against this combined force were the Spanish, but they too had to learn the hard way in the Italian wars, especially at the Battle of Seminara in 1495. At Seminara, the Spanish deployed their tried and tested light cavalry, the so-called jinetes, on the flanks, while rodoleros, infantrymen armed with swords and round shields, were stationed with the pikemen in the center.
Also, this is the first time I've ever heard about this battle, so this is interesting.
The Spanish and their Italian allies took up position behind a river, while the French and Swiss marched directly towards them. As the French knights crossed the river, the jinetes gave them a hard time by repeatedly riding up to them, throwing javelins and turning away at the last moment. But it wasn't long before the tide turned, as the inexperienced Italian infantry were overrun and fled. The Spanish troops only just managed to cover the retreat to Seminara by making a desperate effort to hold back the enemy.
Dang, they got routed and destroyed.
After this battle, the Spanish commander, El Gran Capitan Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, realized that his troops were no match for the combined offensive power of the French and Swiss, and began to thoroughly reform the Spanish armies. Most importantly,
Okay, so because of this battle, they're reforming. Okay.
he equipped large numbers of his infantry with firearms and grouped them in units of 6,000 men, known as coronelias. The effectiveness of this adaptation became apparent in the Battle of Cerignola in 1503, at which the Spanish and the Landsknechts in their service entrenched themselves outside the walls of the town of Cerignola. From their fortified positions, more than 1,000 Spanish arquebusiers poured down shot on the advancing French knights and Swiss mercenaries. Cerignola is not only considered the first battle won with gunpowder, but also the first real pike and shot battle. In 1533, the coronelias were reorganized as tercios. According to the military historian Ignacio Lopez, tercio literally means bundle or.
how often? I'm curious. Was this one of the first usage in Europe of firearms on the battlefield?
1/3 of something. He considers it very likely that the name referred to the three different types of weapon.
I missed that.
Historian Ignacio Lopez, tercio literally means bundle or 1/3 of something. He considers it very likely that the name referred to the three different types of weapon used in the formation: firearms, swords, and pikes. According to the historian Michael Sikora, the tercio dominated the battlefields of Europe up until the 30 Years' War, and its, quote, repeatedly proven military prowess is exemplary for an era of military history, end quote. Like the regiments of other European armies, the tercio consisted of 10 to 12 companies of around 250 soldiers each, totaling 2,500 to 3,000 men. In practice, of course, these numbers varied. Ideally, the main force of the tercio consisted of 1,400 to 2,500 pikemen and swordsmen. On each flank of this main force were shot units, referred to as garrisons, which were positioned close to the melee fighters and consisted of 30 to 60 men each.
Would these rotate? When you shoot, you go to the back of the line?
In addition, 4 squads of 100 to 400 arquebusiers, called sleeves, operated independently around the formation. These were accompanied by a few pikemen or halberdiers to protect them against cavalry attacks. In the event of an attack, they could quickly retreat between the pikemen of the main force. The core of the tercios were groups of Spanish veterans, known for their cohesion and discipline in battle. The veteran tercios were called tercios viejos, old tercios. They were supplemented by soldiers recruited in the region where the tercio was mustered, mainly Walloons, Italians, and Germans. But what was the key element in the success of the tercios? Around 1600, Robert Barrett, a British military writer and poet who lived in Spain for much of his life, wrote, quote, "The one without the other is weakened. Therefore, of necessity, the one is to be coupled and matched with the other, in such convenient proportion that the advantage of the one may help the disadvantage of the other. End
Interesting.
quote. This addressed a key problem. Pikemen on their own could do little to counter riflemen, while a unit of shot was almost defenseless against cavalry attacks. The solution to this problem, and the most important reason for the success of the tercios, was the tactical symbiosis of pike formations and firearms. In the Middle Ages, most armies consisted of a corps of heavy infantry and skirmishers, operating on the flanks or in the rear of the force. On the flanks, they could fire constantly without endangering their comrades, but were vulnerable to enemy cavalry.
Yeah.
They were better protected behind the formation, but as soon as close combat began, they could no longer shoot without endangering their comrades and were no longer protected. As soon as gunpowder weapons came into use, the shot units could no longer take cover behind the infantry anyways, because they couldn't shoot over their comrades in an arch as they could with bows. So, if they were to have a reasonably protected position on the battlefield, they had to be integrated into the infantry formation. In addition, foot soldiers on their own were vulnerable to mounted skirmishers. This had now become even more problematic because mounted units also used gunpowder weapons.
And then they can shoot right off, shoot right off, shoot right off.
Especially pistols.
Yeah, just like
The
that.
most effective tactic was the caracol. Caracol means snail or spiral in Spanish. It was an alternative to shock assaults by cavalry using lances, which had become increasingly
It's like a revolver.
difficult since infantry formations had begun to use long pikes in the 15th century. However, a combination of pikemen and arquebusiers, as in the Spanish Tercios, could counter the caracol, because the attacking cavalry had to get within range of the arquebusiers to shoot at the infantry. In addition, shot units could devastate enemy infantry formations from a distance by performing a countermarch, a maneuver in which the first rank fired their weapons before moving to the rear to reload, leaving the second rank to step forward and fire, and so on.
So it's basically its own version of that.
The shot garrisons on the tercios flanks usually used this maneuver. An army normally consisted of several tercios deployed in a checkerboard formation. The entire infantry formation formed a long front, but not a close line. This was one of the main differences between the medieval shield wall and later linear tactics. This checkered formation had several advantages. Firstly, there was less risk of an army falling apart if one of the tercios was defeated. And secondly, neighboring units could cover the retreat of a battle-worn tercio, making it difficult for the enemy to pursue it. In the same way, exhausted troops could be replaced by reserve units without having to disband the formation. Finally, the clear separation of the individual units slowed down the spread of panic and disorder, and the division of the force into smaller units allowed for more complex tactical interventions. This in turn made the responsibility of command more complicated, and thus contributed to the professionalization of officers. During the 16th century, firearms became more and more effective. As a result, they became
What are those things called again? The sticks.
more important for the tercio, and the proportion of arquebusiers and musketeers per unit rose constantly. While they made up about 10% of the tercio at the beginning of the 16th century, 100 years later, by the 30 Years' War, about half of the infantry were musketeers.
Which makes perfect sense.
Short weapons, such as swords, axes, and short polearms, in contrast, became less important. So the tercios soon consisted almost exclusively of pikemen and musketeers.
And then it'll just be musketeers. And then you'll have like some cavalry with like sabers, right?
In general, gunpowder weapons were much more effective
Yeah.
than, for example, crossbows. According to the military historian Clifford J. Rogers, a heavy steel-bowed crossbow generated an energy of up to 200 joules. In contrast, a well-loaded arquebus ball weighing 1 ounce or 28.3 grams left the barrel with around 2,700 joules of energy. However, it was not only small firearms but also artillery that became an important factor in warfare and strategy. The improved efficiency of gunpowder weapons
I love them. I love their animation when people just. I know this sounds horrible. When people just explode, it's so funny. At least in this animation.
led to higher casualty rates and subsequently to new methods of protection. The unsung hero of war in the early modern period were ditches and trenches, even if they did not bring about quick victories in open field battles. While the
Is that why trench warfare? Well, no, because they did that all the way back to Rome. Never mind.
victor of a medieval battle could hope to escape with minor losses, The victor of an early modern battle often suffered almost as many casualties as the loser. For example, at the Battle of Newport in 1600, both the Dutch, who won the battle, and the defeated Spanish lost around 2,500 men. Because nobody wanted to risk such high losses, open field battles became rarer. The defeat suffered by the Spanish army at Newport is sometimes seen as an early sign of the decline of the Tercio. The same is often said about the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, when Gustavus Adolphus defeated an Austrian Habsburg force under the Count of Tilly. However, just a
I don't know if we saw this. I think we did. Not sure though.
few years later, in 1634, the Spanish faced the Swedes themselves at the Battle of Nördlingen and defeated them. All in all, the Tercio continued to be used. The Tercios performed heroically, but ultimately failed at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643. This battle made it clear that the Tercios were not invincible. When the Spanish army besieged Rocroi, the French sent an army to relieve the town. This forced the Spaniards to turn away from the siege and confront the French army. In the early morning of the 19th of May, the French infantry and the cavalry on their left wing attacked the Spanish, but initially failed to break through. They only managed to stop the subsequent Spanish counterattack with the help of reserve troops. In the meantime, however, the French on the other flank had defeated the Spanish cavalry. But
So was it a cavalry issue then?
instead of attacking the exposed infantry, they rode around the Spanish lines to attack the rear of the remaining Spanish cavalry force.
Well, that's not that insane. I've seen that so many times.
And forced them to retreat. The Spanish artillerymen then also left their positions, abandoning the infantry. It was not long before the Spanish troops had fled, except for 6 battered tercios. When the French commander asked these stalwart remnants of the Spanish army to surrender, they allegedly replied, quote, "His Excellency seems to forget he is facing a Spanish regiment," end quote. And the battle continued. The remaining tercios fended off several cavalry attacks, but suffered enormous losses from artillery fire. Nevertheless, the French were unable to break them. In the end, they had no choice but to grant the Spanish terms of surrender,
Wow.
which were normally only given to the garrison of a besieged fortress. The Spanish were allowed to leave in full armor and under flying colors. Although this defeat shook widespread belief in the invincibility of the tercios, they continued to be used successfully.
The cavalry lost, but they didn't lose. They got routed at one point, but they didn't lose.
By 1700, however, pikes had been almost completely replaced by muskets fitted with bayonets. And in 1704, the tercios were finally abolished and replaced with units inspired by the French model. The wars of the 18th century were characterized by more linear formations, which the Dutch reforms under Maurice of Nassau and the Swedish reforms under Gustavus Adolphus had provided a foretaste of.
Beautiful. Pike and Shot Warfare. What an era of warfare that was. And it's just technology, evolving technology, tactics, art of war, mingling all together. Who was the best at Pike and Shot? Was it the Spanish? Do you guys think it was the Spanish? Was it the Swedes? Did they evolve it? Let me know below. I'm just dipping my toes in it, basically, so far. This is a fun little video, as always. SandRhoman History. Leave me some video suggestions. Our next video for this channel, I will definitely look at that. But yeah, crazy cool, like, blip in time where you go from blades to artillery to some gunpowder weapons to pike and shot to musketeers to nothing but gunpowder. So cool, so interesting. And I wonder, he said like some battles kind of just, you lost about the same amount of men. I wonder how courage changed, because I think you lose courage when you see lead being traveled thousands of feet per second in front of you versus when you just see people running towards you with blades. Interesting stuff. Thank you guys so much for watching, as always. I appreciate you guys so much. Consider subscribing. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.